Hi, this is Craig Stocks for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today I want to talk about processing this narrowband image primarily in Photoshop. I'm familiar with Photoshop, so that's what I use. And there's a few things that I can show you, I think, that'll make it a lot easier for you to do your processing in Photoshop if that's where you're currently working. If you're currently working in PixInsight or APP or something else and you're happy with what you're doing, then there's no reason to change. But if you do like to use Photoshop, then I'll show you a few tricks that may help you. So first, let me talk a little bit about the image. This, of course, is the Elephant Trunk Nebula, and it was imaged in narrowband hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, along with red, green, and blue for the stars. And that's something I've started doing pretty routinely. This is a good example. I shot probably a handful of frames in each of hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen at 10-minute subs, so 600-second subs. And that gave me good detail in the gas structure. And then in the same sequence, I also did some red, green, and blue filters for about 120 seconds each. And my goal there was to really capture nice, small, sharp stars with good star color in RGB color, as I do like to mix RGB color stars with narrowband images. So the way I've processed this, and let's just look at the finished file and then we'll walk back. I've got 3 layers, one for hydrogen, one for oxygen, and one for sulfur. And probably one of the things I do that's most different from what else you see is I use a layer-based process rather than a channel-based. So each one of these layers contains my hydrogen, my oxygen, and my sulfur data, and then just a series of adjustment layers to tweak those, and that eventually led me to a starless layer where I used Star Exterminator to remove the stars, did a little more finessing of that layer, and then added back the stars from the RGB file. So that's a very high level what I did. Let's kind of zoom down into it and we'll look at how I did it. If you've used Deep Sky Stacker, or DSS as most people will call it, one of the things it does is automatically save a 32-bit TIFF of each one of your stacks. And when I ran through my data, I always go in the same sequence. I always start with hydrogen, then oxygen, then sulfur, then red, then green, then blue. So that way I know that as it saves subsequent files, in autosave 1, autosave 2, autosave 3, and so forth, I know that those are hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, red, green, and blue because I always do it in the same order. So to start with, I grabbed the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur and opened each one of those in Photoshop. So here is the hydrogen, for instance, and it doesn't look like much, but this is a 32-bit linear TIFF file. It hasn't been stretched. It doesn't really have anything done to it yet. So the first thing I need to do is convert it to a 16-bit image. And one of the tricks you can do is when you go to Image, Mode, and choose 16 bits per channel, because this is a locked background layer, you have the option of choosing how you want to convert it from 32-bit to 16-bit. And what I like to do, you'll get a little pop-up menu, and what I like to do is use Equalize Histogram. And what that does is it basically applies an auto stretch as it converts from 32-bit to 16-bit, and you can see all the detail that it brings out doing that auto stretch. So this is my hydrogen data, and I can just double-click on the word background as soon as it's done processing. I can double-click on that and just name this hydrogen so I can keep track of what I'm doing. Now I've already done the same thing with my oxygen, and you can see I've labeled it oxygen, and my sulfur data, and I've labeled it sulfur. And because these were all stacked with the same reference frame in Deep Sky Stacker, I know that they're all going to be aligned. So I can go to the oxygen one first, and I'll tap V to activate the Move tool, and I can click and drag up to the tab where my hydrogen layer is, and still holding the shift key or the mouse button down, drag back down into the image, hold the shift key to tell Photoshop I want it aligned, and then let go of the mouse button. And what it does is paste the oxygen on top of hydrogen so that everything is aligned. And in fact, if I click the eyeball to turn this on and off, you can see the stars are all in the same place. Now let's do the same thing with the sulfur data. Click, drag up to the tab, drag down into the image, hold the shift key and release, and we now have our sulfur data. And I could just very simply assign the color channels to these, but I'm going to put each one into a group in case I want to further adjust each one. So I'll just do a Control G, that puts hydrogen into a group, Control G to put oxygen into a group, Control G to put sulfur into a group. And the reason I put them into a group is basically what happens in a group stays in the group. So if I apply a levels or a curves adjustment to one of these layers, it will only affect the contents of that layer. Now we need to add some color, and the easiest way, this is an RGB color image. If I double click on this sulfur group, and out here in the area where you really don't see anything, that will bring up the layer style dialog box, and the first option there is blending options, and you notice in the center you have the 3 channels listed, red, green, and blue. Since I want to map sulfur to red, I don't need the green and blue channels, I only need the red channel. So I just turn those off, and we now have sulfur mapped to the red channel. If I go to the oxygen, which we normally would want to color map as blue, I don't need red and green, so I just turn those off. And we now have a narrowband Hubble palette sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen image where sulfur is mapped as red, oxygen is blue, and hydrogen is green. And it's just that easy to apply colors. And normally I would rotate this 90 degrees so that the elephant's trunk is vertical, but we'll just leave it for now. Now if I want to fine-tune any of these, let's say I want to brighten up the blues a little bit, I can come into the oxygen, add a levels adjustment, and if I play with the levels here, I can add more blue, more contrast. If I add or take away blue in the shadows, add or take away blue in the midtones, or even in the highlights, if I want to add some blue to the highlights, I can play with each one of these. And again, because it's in a group, that levels adjustment only affects the data in that group. So in this case, it's only affecting the blue, which is oxygen. I might want to do something with hydrogen, or I'm sorry, with sulfur. Same way, I can come in here and tweak it and play with the colors, turn up the red in the highlights, turn it down in the shadows, kind of whatever I want to do. And it's just that easy. So this gave me a really good starting point of a color mapped narrowband Hubble palette image. And now let's switch over to the finished image, and we'll just kind of look at the individual steps. So at that point, I turn these off. This is pretty much what we're looking at. I have the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur groups with just a little bit of a levels adjustment for each one. And then I added some other adjustment layers on top of these. And one thing you'll notice if you watch my tutorials, I almost never flatten an image because I want to be able to go back and change things if I need to. So I've added a gradient adjustment, and if I alt-click on the visibility icon here, that will show just that layer. And it's a little hard to see, but this is a white inverted gradient, so it's adding some lightness to the outside edges to kind of reduce the vignette. So it is brightening the outside and leaving the center alone. So it just kind of does a reverse vignette. And then I played with some color mapping, adjusting the colors with selective color, hue saturation, curves, added a little contrast, another adjustment with hue saturation, and then another adjustment with hue saturation. And that got me to this point. And at this point, I wanted to get rid of the stars. And the easiest way to do that, unfortunately, is to create a stamped layer, which you can do in Photoshop by holding the Shift, Control, alternate keys and pressing E. And when you do that, it will stamp everything that's visible below where the currently selected layer is. So by selecting this layer, do Shift, Control, Alt, and E, and that will create this layer, which is just a single layer combined of all the layers below it. I then ran Star Exterminator on that layer. That gave me this starless layer. And I did some additional tweaking and adjusting on it. But then I wanted to get the stars. And as I mentioned, I wanted RGB stars. So let's go back over and look at our files. I have autosave 3, 4, and 5. And I know those are red, green, and blue. And what I really want to extract out of there is just the stars, and primarily the star color. So the way I stretched the first 3 doesn't work as well for pulling out the star colors. So we'll do that a different way. What we'll do is go to File, Scripts, and load files into Stack. And then I can browse and go locate autosave 3, 4, and 5 and open those. And when you do that, and I actually have already done it, it loads those into a single image where here's autosave 3, autosave 4, autosave 5, and again I know these are red, green, and blue. And these are, as I mentioned, 32-bit, so I need to convert this to 16-bit. Now, because this isn't just a locked background layer, it doesn't give me the option of Equalize Histogram, where it will automatically stretch. The only option it says, do I want to merge these 3 layers or don't merge? And I want to keep them separate because I'm going to color map them, so I'll say don't merge. And this just is doing a simple conversion to 16-bit without doing anything special. So now we have this converted to a 16-bit image, and I want to use a completely different stretching method. And this is the inverse hyperbolic sine method. It's somewhat the method that's used in PixInsight for doing the arcsine H or inverse hyperbolic sine method. And you can approximate it in Photoshop, and this is a method that Mark Shelley has described. First thing I need to do is create a stamped layer of all 3 of these. So Shift, Control, Alt, E, and that gives me just a single stamped layer. Now I want to desaturate that, and I can do Shift, Control, U is a shortcut key that just desaturates, and then Control J, I'll just make a copy of that. So now I have 2 desaturated copies of these 3 layers. This top layer I'm going to put into divide blending mode using the blending options here. The layer below it I'm going to drop into a group because we'll want to apply some curves, and I will put it in multiply blending mode. So again, if you multiply by something and then divide by the same thing, you get back what you started with. But I can add a curve to this multiply layer. Expand this a little bit so you can see it better. And Mark Shelley has provided some curves that are kind of pre-made. So let's use the arcsine 30, which is a fairly kind of a light to medium stretch. And in order to truly duplicate the inverse hyperbolic sine, we need to do this twice. So I'll just Control J, we'll duplicate that layer. And we now have this stretched. Oh, we need to add the color. So let me come back to our top layer. Again, this one is blue, so let's turn off red and green. The middle layer is green, so we will turn off red and blue, because all we want is green. The bottom layer, by the way, has red, green, and blue, all three, but in a sense, we're replacing the green layer with this second layer, and we're replacing the blue with this third layer. So all that really comes through from the bottom layer is the red. It looks kind of ugly, and that's unfortunately the way Photoshop does its previews. You have to zoom in quite a bit in order for it to render the preview correctly. Or, again, if I do a stamp visible, Shift Control Alt E, then that will combine everything into one flattened layer. And now it renders the way it should. And you can see we've got some color cast going on here, so let's just add a color balance layer. And I'll focus first on the shadows. And it looks like we need to add some red and maybe adjust the color of the shadows a little bit. We can use the eyedropper tool and drop a color sample on here somewhere if we want to get kind of precise with it. And we can see we need more blue and less red. So if I put in more blue and less red, so that all three are around 30 something, 35, 36. There, that has the background pretty well neutralized. I can clear that color sample. And at this point now I have just nice, colorful stars. The background's pretty well neutralized. The stars have good color showing through. So I would go ahead and apply this adjustment to the flattened layer, because all I'm going to really save from this one is just the one layer. And then if I drag this onto this layer, everything will align and I can replace the stars. Now in reality, I've already done that with this layer. I've dragged the star layer over and I put it into a group called stars. This layer I put in linear dodge mode, and then I used a levels adjustment to make sure that we weren't adding any brightness from the background, but only the stars. And by adjusting the brightness of the background, you can kind of play with, to some extent, the size and brightness of the stars. If you want bigger stars or smaller stars, these kind of filter them down or clamp down on them, or you can let a little bit more through. And the nice part is you can do all of this visually, just based on what looks good to you. Likewise, you can adjust the brightness of the stars overall, and just find a good balance. And that's basically how I put this image together. The last thing I did was save this as a PSB file, which is Photoshop's large format or large document format, where it lets you store really large files, and that way you don't have to constantly flatten or commit things to pixels before you want to. So you keep everything completely editable, and then after this is saved, I typically will open it in Lightroom and do my final cropping and any final tweaks or adjustments that I want to do there to create the final image. So basically that's the processing in Photoshop. I did the initial stack in Deep Sky Stacker, and then loading the autosave files that were produced by Deep Sky Stacker. I stretched those two different ways. The narrowband layers I stretched using the Equalize Histogram primarily, and then did a little tweaking with levels. The RGB data for the color, I did an inverse hyperbolic sine stretch based on Mark Shelley's technique, and that gave me good color in the stars, and then combined it all into one image in Photoshop. And of course, one of the keys is the way I color map the groups or the layers by simply turning off the channel that I don't want. So again, for the red channel, you go to that layer group and you simply turn off the green and blue, so that red is the only thing left. And that basically does the same thing as all of the copying and pasting and copying into channels that I see done so often. So that's the way I approach it. Let me know if you have any questions. And once again, I'm Craig Stocks, and I'm presenting all this on behalf of the Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. Thanks, and have a nice day.